exception of Elliot, everyone already has been. So that's a good initiative, good initiative. Well, anyway, this is my first time doing this, so please do take it easy on me. There's a couple more people than usual, which probably isn't a good thing. I will try to keep the heresy content to below 50% of my message. So I didn't want to go after Jono, Amanda, and Clement because I figured they probably set the bar too high. But I think I can compete with Randy. Worst comes to worst, he's taught me that there's always YouTube. So we should be okay. So lately we've been discussing the theme of prayer. And I wanted to talk to you about an aspect of prayer that I think is very powerful. And that is the way that prayer can give us perspective. I'd like to start in Matthew chapter 14, verse 22 to 31. And it's a story a lot of you probably already know, but I kind of want to pad the time on my message, so we'll read it anyway. And it goes like this. Immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" Prayer and perspective. This is a thought I personally found very comforting, so I hope it encourages you in some way. And it was really applicable for me because last semester didn't really feel like the greatest time of my life. You know, a couple of weeks in, I remember my grandma looked like she was about to die and we were all stressing about that. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, my uncle really did die of a heart attack. And in the middle of it all, I felt like I'd gone from the smartest person in every lecture theater I sat in to the dumbest kid in my honors cohort. But I think in the middle of all that, I got an idea of how Peter must have felt like in Matthew chapter 14. You know, at the start of the year, I was really excited, and I was all like, "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water." All while Katy Perry's Roar played in the background, because my life has background music, just in case you were wondering. But then the wind came and the waves came, and somehow I lost my perspective. That's one of the reasons prayer is so important, because there's nothing like prayer to get you perspective on your problems. When you talk with somebody and you converse with them, you end up looking at them, and I think prayer works the same way. Yeah. Because when you pray, you talk to God, and you end up looking at God instead of focusing on your problems. It's good. This is obviously a very incomplete list, but I'd like to talk to you today about 3 things that I'm reminded of when I pray. And the first 2 come from Psalm 121, verse 1 and 2, which goes like this. "I lift my eyes to the hills. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth." Prayer lifts my eyes, and that does 2 things for me. First, it helps me to remember who my source is. My help comes from the Lord. It's a powerful thing to know your source. You know, I always hate it when my devices run out of battery. I have this wireless keyboard now, and I prefer the days of wired keyboards. Is anyone with me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Come on.
Well, anyway, I have this wireless keyboard, and it runs on AAA batteries when every other device on the house runs on AA batteries, and I'm not quite sure why. And normally I have this trick where if something runs out of battery, I go find another device, and I take the batteries out of that, and I put it in the thing that right now. Then when I go to use the thing that I took the batteries out of, it's not working, and I'm like, which idiot took the batteries out? And I'm like, wait a second, that was me. Well, anyway, I didn't have any AAA batteries, so I was stuck for half a day, unable to use my computer because my keyboard had run out of battery. The point is, you can't run something on the wrong power source.
That's right.
And you and I, we were designed to run on God's power and God's grace.
Yes.
And sometimes that's easier to forget than we might think. And we end up struggling in our own strength, trying to cram these AA batteries into this AAA battery slot, or charge our iPhones with Samsung Galaxy phone chargers. And it just doesn't work. And we're left feeling tired and empty and confused and drained. Well, speaking of iPhones, you guys know that the iPhone is the holiest phone, right?
That's the euphemism.
Is that your heresy? Is that talking heresy count?
It's actually biblical. You know, just like I am is one of God's holiest names, iPhone is. So just in case you're wondering, if you don't have an
It's the
iPhone,
apple that led Adam to sin.
that's a good point. I actually don't have a comeback for that.
God created the galaxy. God created the galaxies.
What?
God created the galaxies.
Oh. No.
Too late now.
Now
Yeah.
that's taking cheap shots. Our help comes from the Lord, and I think prayer is a great way to remind ourselves of that, because all too often we get caught up in this struggle where it becomes all about us and what we need to do, when it really isn't. It's all about Jesus and what he's done and what he's doing.
Come on.
Okay, the second thing that prayer reminds me of is God's power and authority. In verse 2, it describes God as the maker of heaven and earth. Now, I don't know what all of you are going through, or have been through, or will go through in your lives, but I do know that no matter how big your circumstance is, it can't compare to how big our God is.
Yes.
He's the maker of heaven and earth, and when I realize how big he is, I can start to get perspective on my problems. The battle is his, and when you realize the power that is for you, you can stop worrying so much about the circumstances that are against you. I don't know if anyone here watches ice hockey, but in ice hockey, there are two very interestingly named roles for players. One is the pest, and the other is the enforcer. The pest is supposed to agitate the other players, but when it comes to the actual fighting, the enforcer steps in. And sometimes, like the pest, and I think I just insulted everyone here by comparing you to a pest, but sometimes, like the pest, we get ourselves in battles that we just aren't strong enough to fight, or find ourselves in situations we just aren't strong enough to handle. And when that happens, prayer reminds us who's in our corner. It reveals God's identity, and it lets you know who's backing you up. Finally, prayer reminds me of God's heart for me. I think a lot of us don't doubt God's power. If I asked you if you knew God was bigger than your circumstance or your situation, you'd probably answer yes in a heartbeat. But sometimes when it comes to God's love, we just don't feel as secure. Well, actually this week, I said last week because I knew we sang the song that week, but this week now. We sang that song, Amazing Grace. And I know I can't sing it as well as Randy does, but my favorite part of the song goes, I can see you now, and I can see the love in your eyes. And God is looking at each of us with so much love, and I wonder if sometimes we see it or if we just miss it. Daniel chapter 3 tells the story of how King Nebuchadnezzar made a gold image that everyone had to worship, and those who didn't worship it would be thrown into a blazing furnace, you know, sort of typical Babylonian king kind of craziness. Well, anyway, there were these three Jewish guys named Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego who refused to worship the image and were thrown into the furnace. And listen to what Daniel chapter 3, verse 24 to 25 says. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished, and he rose in haste and spoke, saying to his counselors, Did we not cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? They answered and said to the king, True, O king. Look, he answered, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. Sometimes there's nothing like the tough times and the fire of adversity to make us feel like God's distant. But I love that in the middle, even in the midst, or maybe especially in the middle of the fire of our troubles, Jesus is right there with us. That he isn't a God who will leave us or forsake us. That when things look like they're falling apart, he's right by our side.
Come on.
That he isn't some distant, uncaring God, but he's a loving and close God. Romans chapter 8 puts it so beautifully. It says, For I am convinced that neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither the present nor the future, nor any powers, neither height nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus. God's love is unconditional. You know, I'm actually terrible at evangelizing. I think if I talk to someone who was on the verge of conversion, they probably join secular student society. And I remember I was talking about it with Ken one-on-one last year one time, and he said to me, I don't think you can get any worse, but even if you don't get any better, I'll never be disappointed in you. And that meant a lot to me. And I think God's love is the same way. You know, it's unrelenting in the face of our shortcomings and our failures. No matter how many times I fall short and no matter how many times I miss it, when I pray, God is taking the time to listen to me and remind me of his love for me.
Come on.
You know, in the middle of the storm, when I stop focusing on Jesus and I start thinking about how I walk, I end up sinking. When I start thinking about how I can deal with the waves by trying harder or doing better, I get in trouble. And that kind of thinking can just come so easily to us because sometimes the pain is so real and the danger is so real and Jesus doesn't really seem as real at the time. And I wonder if that was the case with Peter. If in the very real danger of the moment, he started thinking about how he was walking rather than who he was walking to. But here's the thing. As Peter and I have kind of learned the hard way, no matter how well you walk, you just can't walk on water. Don't you hate physics sometimes? I know I do. So when you're struggling and when you don't know what to do, and the wind is howling and the waves are swirling, I encourage you to do this. Pray, look to Jesus, see his power, see his love for you. Get perspective on your problems and walk in faith into the fullness of all that God has for you.
Awesome. Let's put our hands together. That is, oh man, there's a job opening for a pastor at my church. You need to put in your resume. We can't pay you anything, but we need, that was awesome.